Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat about, I think, one of the most important topics that we need to cover in the fitness world, and that is the relationship between resistance training and surviving cancer. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Yeah, I know this is one of these topics I've covered multiple times, but I think it's so important that we discuss it, that we make sure that people understand this. This needs to be out there. People need to know about this. And what people do need to understand, a lot of people say things like, well, cancer, is unavoidable. People are going to get cancer no matter what. There's nothing we can do about it. And the reality is that the majority of cases of cancer are lifestyle induced. I'm not saying that people who have done nothing wrong don't get cancer, because that does seem to be the case. But what meta-analysis showed a couple years back, when we started looking at it really closely, and by we, I don't mean like me personally, because people get upset when I say that. I mean the researchers and medical doctors involved. What this meta-analysis determined was, depending upon the specific cancer type, that a person's chances of developing it, again, because everyone gets cancer cells. Everyone gets cancer cells. It's a question, do they grow large enough to become tumors and stuff before your body fights them off? But what they determined was that getting cancer, depending upon the type, was somewhere between 70% and 90% lifestyle induced. Meaning our lifestyles themselves determined it, whereas in the other 10 to 30% seemed to be genetics. Again, non-environmental factors is just people were just so genetically predisposed to it that no matter what they did, they were going to get it. But that's only 10 to 30% depending upon the type. Everything else is related to diet, exercise, environmental pollutants, all this other stuff. It's things that you are doing or exposed to that caused it. The majority of the time, anywhere between 70 and 90%. And so when we look at it from that perspective, we need to understand that the choices we make affect that. And cancer is pretty terrible. I've lost people I loved to cancer. I've seen it firsthand, and if a lot of you out there have too, I'm sure most of you have lost someone you cared about to cancer. And if you haven't yet, just get older, just wait, it's going to happen. So this really is a serious topic. And when we talk about what goes on in the body with it, we always see a lot of people who promote different diet things talk about is insulin sensitivity, right? That's one of the things that the ketogenic people and everyone talk about is circulating insulin. Well, when we start looking at what you can do, what affects insulin sensitivity in the body more than anything else that you possibly do? The amount of intense exercise you do. Believe it or not, that is actually more important than diet. In other words, someone who is a highly trained athlete, someone who is very, very highly trained, right? They have a significant amount of muscle mass. They engage in a lot of high intensity activity. They actually have lower circulating insulin even if they were to eat 60 or 70% of their calories through the day from white rice. They will still have an average lower circulating insulin level than someone on a keto diet. So that's important to understand there, that they're circulating insulin and their insulin response is very low. So what we need to understand is that when we're talking about cancer cells in the body are very insulin sensitive. They're competing for nutrients in your bloodstream. They're competing for nutrients in your bloodstream. And so therefore people who have higher levels of circulating insulin, which it's related to diet, but it's not as much related to that as you would think compared to other lifestyle factors, such as the amount of muscle you have, the amount of fat you have, things like that, which is one reason we know that obese people develop cancer at a much higher rate, right? They develop cancer at a much, much higher rate. And a lot of people think of people with cancer as these skinny, sickly people. Yeah, because that's the cancer making them lose weight. Their appetite goes away. The cancer steals all the nutrients. They waste away. But you'd be surprised how many of those people you see who look like they've wasted away were morbidly obese before the cancer really hit them. So being obese is actually a big factor. But because again, it has to do with insulin resistance. It has to do with higher circulating insulin and everything else in the body. And it giving the cancer easier access to nutrients. Whereas in people who resistance train, people who strength train, and when I mean that, I don't just mean someone who comes in and does a bunch of curls and bench press. I'm talking about people who train their entire body. Resistance training dramatically increases insulin resistance. I mean, HIIT type cardio and sprinting and stuff can too, but it improves insulin sensitivity dramatically. And the more muscle mass you have, the more resistant you are to cancer. right? And that's because it has to do with the fact that the muscle tissue tends to compete with the cancer cells that are forming for nutrients. And if you've got enough muscle mass, it's very, very insulin sensitive. It competes very effectively for it. And then we have the fact that it also fights off the muscle wasting element that comes with it, which actually is one of the reasons cancer kills people. So what does this mean based upon the statistics? Well, when we start looking at the numbers out there, what researchers figured out years ago, when they started looking at different epidemiology, what they found is that people who resistance train, and that's all people, like, so this isn't even saying, hey, what about people who train really hard? They didn't even break it up like that. What they looked at was the general populace versus people who resistance train. And what they found is that people who lift weights in any capacity get cancer at 50% of the rate of the general population. 50%. Now, we can always say correlation doesn't equal causation, right? We could say that because you can say, well, most people who resistance train probably live healthier lifestyles. That's true, and that's a factor. But you've got to remember, a lot of people who resistance train also just play around and don't really train that hard. That's the majority. So you factor that in also, but then when we do look at what we know based upon athletes or people who train vigorously or hard with weights, their circulating insulin is much lower, and we know that circulating insulin levels are also an enormous factor in cancer rates. So we do have an actual causation there also. So yeah, we could look at it and say, well, correlation doesn't equal causation, but we also have a very legitimate medical explanation. And here's where it gets further shown and highlighted in the data. We also know, looking at the data out there, again, meta-analysis have looked at it, people who resistance train who do get cancer, because you cut your cancer rate in half, you could still get cancer. There are still plenty of people who work out and people who resistance train who get cancer, right? Well, when we look at that, what happens to the people who resistance train? They are twice as likely to survive cancer while going through treatment, meaning when they go through whatever therapies are doing, chemo or radiation therapy or anything else, people who lift weights have double the survival rate. You are twice as likely to survive and beat cancer. You're twice as likely. All right, that's not insignificant. What does that have to do with? Well, it's multifold in nature. Number one, the better circulating insulin levels. Like, you have less circulating insulin because you're more insulin sensitive due to the muscle tissue. You're able to help starve the cancer out better as you're going through whatever treatments you're going through. All right, that gives you a distinct advantage. That gives you a distinct advantage. Then we have the whole muscle wasting thing. What is it always Mark Ripito always says? Strong people are harder to kill. All right, and we know that. Strength makes it harder for you to die the stronger you are, and granted, things can still happen. I mean, a head wound is a head wound. But people who have denser bones, stronger muscle tissue, things like that, are just more likely to survive everything. We're more likely to survive car hits, car crashes, falling down, gunshots, stabbings. I mean, we just have a higher survival rate. Our bodies are tougher. They're more resilient. Well, it's the same thing also when we're dealing with fighting through the cancer or chemo and everything else. People who continue to resistance train through it, they hold on to their muscle tissue better. And the more muscle you can hold on to, the longer you can survive, because again, there's a muscle wasting element to it. And that muscle wasting element makes the cancer grow quicker because it has less tissue to compete with. So it helps you stave off death. It helps you stave off death from cancer. And again, it doubles your chances. It doubles your chances. Again, this isn't an insignificant situation. So when we start looking at it from that perspective, resistance training, and particularly the bigger muscles in your body, your legs, your back, because that's the ones that are going to compete most in terms of total tissue weight and insulin sensitivity, particularly legs. In other words, do your squats. Squatting will help you fight off cancer. So what that means is that people who resistance train are just half as likely to get cancer already. And if you do get it, you double your chances of surviving. And what we need to keep in mind, there's probably a dose-dependent relationship there. Meaning that's just looking at the general statistics of everybody who works out with weights. When you look at the causation, and it has to do with the insulin sensitivity, muscle retention, all these different things, the people who train pretty vigorously, who train pretty hard, I would expect those numbers to be dramatically improved over someone who just works out, right? Because there's going to be a difference between the two. And if we know that just being in that category in general improves it that much, I'd be willing to bet that people who train fairly hard people who get under a heavy squat bar a couple times a week, right? People who are training their entire body with serious resistance training and progressive overload, they're going to have all those things even more so than someone who just trains lightly and a little bit. They're going to have all those exact same biomarkers to a larger degree, and we know that that's what helps fight it off. So I would expect a lot of you out there who are, squatting 2 or 3 times a week, you're going to have even better numbers. Again, just based upon what we know about the data and the causation, we can extrapolate that as a reasonable conclusion. So in other words, guys, do your squats, do your deadlifts, do your big heavy movements, and convince anyone who you love, who you care about, who you don't want to develop cancer and some of these other health issues to go ahead and get under a heavy barbell. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.